It was one of the most significant campaigns of the 20th century, and one of the most amazing physical feats ever attempted. Surrounded by hostile armies, 87,000 soldiers escaped and traveled nearly 6,000 miles on foot in just 1 year. It was a desperate retreat by the communist Red Chinese Army under Mao Zedong from the nationalist forces of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Many say it was a brilliant military maneuver. Others claim that it was a series of strategic blunders. While the facts are sometimes elusive, most historians agree the human accomplishment was astounding. It was a tale of endurance against overwhelming odds. For the first time in the West, the survivors revealed the story as they saw it. It was a controversial event that not only changed China, but the rest of the world as well. April 1934, Jiangxi Province, China. Two armies were locked in intense combat. China's central government, the nationalists, had an overwhelming military advantage, and they were using it to surround and destroy their avowed enemy, the Chinese communists. On the verge of annihilation, the communist leaders were desperate for a solution. The story of what happened next has many sides. It is part legend, part mythology, and historians still debate the elusive facts. But on this they agree. The communist decision in 1934 changed the country of China forever. For the winners of this epic clash, the prize was immense. With the world's oldest sustained culture spanning over 4,000 years, this was a land steeped in mystery and tradition. In the 1920s, China was a sleeping world power, and its vast natural resources were barely tapped. 80% of its 450 million people were poor peasants who lived in the countryside. Of those, well over half owned no land. They often worked for little more than food from absentee landlords. At this time, China was a country in name only. Deeply fragmented, some of its states or provinces were governed by powerful warlords.
他所谓军阀呢，就是拥兵自重。他有一部分部队，在这3万人、5万人，他就不听中央的命令，他要自己为所欲为。
China's central government was run by the nationalists, who were also known by their Chinese name of Kuomintang. Their founder, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, overthrew the last emperor of China in 1911, with the promise to defeat the warlords and unify all of China. After Sun Yat-sen died in 1925, a well-educated soldier politician, Chiang Kai-shek, took control of the Nationalist Party. But rather than defeat all the warlords that controlled parts of the country, he kept alliances with many of them. The people most threatening to Chiang Kai-shek were the emerging communists. For years, young Chinese leaders were being groomed in the Soviet Union to implement the Russians' new system of government. Then they returned to China, and like the warlords, they established their own areas of government and power. Two of the most prominent figures in the movement were Zhou Enlai and a tall, charismatic young leader, Mao Zedong.
He was a very good speaker, and he would introduce humor and anecdote, and he had all kinds of language that appealed to the ordinary person, not just to the intellectuals.
By promising to give the property of China's wealthy landlords to the peasants, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai's party thrived in remote areas. By the early 1930s, the Reds had their own currency, educational system, and military army. Over 2.5 million Chinese people were under their control. The communists and the nationalists both wanted to unify China. But the nationalists also sought to preserve China's social order. They knew the communists aimed for nothing less than a total revolution, an uprising that would violently overthrow the upper class from its age-old position of power and prestige. For Chiang Kai-shek and his army of over 1 million men, the Reds were a force that had to be stopped. The battleground in the looming civil war between the Reds and the nationalists was immense. Rising out of the east, dominating the continent of Asia, China was a land of enormous contrasts. It had vast stretches of mountainous terrain, wide swaths of rich farmland, and some of the most extensive river systems in the world. By 1931, the communists had carved out several areas of influence in remote outlying territories. In Anhui province, the 4th Red Army was in charge, but its days in power there were numbered. In the south, Mao Zedong's 1st Red Army held tightly to much of Jiangxi province. Here, the army protected the key members of the Chinese Communist Party. Surrounding them on the map, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists controlled most of southern China, but their influence on ordinary Chinese peasants was far more limited. Chiang Kai-shek pursued the communists relentlessly and launched several major military assaults with the intent to annihilate Mao Zedong's army. But they were turned back each time. Mao's outnumbered forces prevailed with hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. The defeat seemed to make Chiang even more determined. On September 18, 1931, his forces were again closing in on Jiangxi province. This time, 300,000 men were marshaled to deliver a knockout blow. But on that day, China's fortune changed. Nearly 1,000 miles north, the Japanese Imperial Army invaded the northeast Chinese region of Manchuria. The untapped potential of China's natural resources had not gone unnoticed by Japan. The Japanese already occupied the island of Taiwan, all of the Korean peninsula, and some smaller parts of China that they kept after their war with Russia in 1905. While the Japanese rolled into northeast China, the world watched to see how Chiang Kai-shek would respond. The United States and Great Britain were determined to blunt the Japanese advance. Bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes were shipped to the nationalists. Now, Chiang Kai-shek was in a tenuous situation. The Japanese army was on the move in the north. The Red Army seemed firmly entrenched in the south. His American and British advisors pressured him to attack the Japanese. The decision Chiang announced to his staff was momentous. In May 1933, Chiang again set his sights on the 1st Red Army. To clear the way, he approved the Tonggu Truce, with a new Japanese-appointed government in the northeast. But Mao's men still won out, despite being outnumbered. But ironically, Mao's victories led some in Moscow to believe the Reds were capable of more than just ambush-style guerrilla warfare. When Mao rejected suggestions that he adopt more aggressive tactics, he offended several of his colleagues. In turn, they engineered a political coup.
毛泽东也被剥夺了这个领导权，苏维埃政府当个那个政府主席，当时他不是中革军委的主席，他是苏维埃政府的主席。
One of the key figures behind Mao's removal was a German named Otto Braun, one of the few Westerners in the Chinese Communist movement.
李德在苏联学到的一套作战方法呢，是一些城市战和阵地战的方法。
Otto Braun's ambitious military defense strategy called for the construction of blockhouses made of earth and wood to, as he put it, defend every inch of Red territory. In the meantime, Chiang Kai-shek was re-evaluating his offensive military tactics. With the approval of Germany's newly elected Chancellor, Adolf Hitler, senior Wehrmacht officer General Hans von Seeckt was dispatched to China to help Chiang with his 5th annihilation campaign. In December 1933, Chiang Kai-shek mobilized over 1 million men to blockade Jiangxi province with a series of defensive forts, trenches, and checkpoints. During the campaign, they constructed some 3,000 concrete reinforced blockhouses and pillboxes, allowing them to control virtually every road and path to the communist area. The strategy was successful. By the summer of 1934, the Reds lost 58% of their territory in Jiangxi province. Under Mao's strategy, when the nationalists advanced, they would retreat. Now the Reds tried to hold their ground. By October 1934, the Communists lost nearly 60,000 soldiers. Facing total destruction, the leaders of the First Red Army made a crucial decision: to escape with their entire army and begin what would become known as the Long March. But that was all they knew. In early October, the First Red Army secretly began recalling its men from the fighting front. However, there was much confusion. On October 17, 1934, the Red Army crossed the Yudu River. The Long March had begun. It would take them on an epic journey across China, fighting against enemy troops and hostile terrain every step of the way. It would become a major turning point of the revolution, and one of the defining moments in Chinese history. But for now, all the Reds knew was that they were marching into the unknown, and they faced almost certain destruction. October 1934. Following devastating losses to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces, the Chinese Communists streamed out of their territory in Jiangxi province. This began one of the most significant events in modern China: the Long March. The formation of nearly 87,000 moved in two main columns to the west and to the south. The Reds were fortunate that the nationalists had even less information.
Well, it apparently took Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists 2 to 3 weeks to realize that the communists had really left. He couldn't count on some of the military units and the generals along the southern flank. And the communists were able to move out through there in pretty large columns because those guys were also, those leaders were hedging their bets. They didn't know who was going to win this war.
Between the two main protective columns, 15,000 party members, military leaders, and government administrators marched ahead. In this center group, Mao Zedong struggled ahead. He had come down with a severe case of malaria and was often carried on a stretcher. 26,000 other Reds who were badly wounded or too ill to walk were left behind to blend into the countryside. The Red Army started the Long March relatively well supplied with light weapons. Many of these were arms captured from the nationalists. They carried over 30,000 rifles, light machine guns, and heavy machine guns. Although the Reds had only 38 mortars, they hauled a store of almost 3,500 mortar shells. They also carried 75,000 hand grenades. Still, there was a notable lack of heavier weapons. The Communists did transport tons of other equipment.
They brought the whole apparatus to begin with that would allow them to run a government. They thought they were going to be in a place where they were the government, and the new government, the communist printing presses, the mints for the coinage, over and above the heavy military equipment.
The Reds had no boats or vehicles. Some senior commanders were supplied with horses, but the vast majority simply walked. At times, the length of the Red Army columns combined to stretch nearly 50 miles. In the meantime, among the Red leaders, the strategic goal of the retreat was still in dispute. Mao argued for a breakout from the Jiangxi pocket, followed by an attack by the Red Army on the nationalists from their rear. But this was rejected in favor of Otto Braun's idea for a full-scale retreat from Jiangxi, with a push westwards toward a communist stronghold in Hunan province. There, a number of smaller Red Army units had recently formed the Second Red Army. In late October 1934, the First Red Army came up against the southwest wall of the Guomindang blockade. On paper, the combined forces here numbered over 200,000 men. They were pre-positioned and in terrain that worked to their favor to stop the Reds. But the divided loyalties of the local commander, a warlord named Chen Jitang, served to undermine Chiang Kai-shek. The diplomatic efforts of the communists paid off. The Reds pushed the cork out of the bottle and streamed out of Jiangxi province. But as their army swung westward, they were attacked by the nationalists on the ground and from the air. The communists were particularly vulnerable to strafing attacks. They had no planes of their own, while the nationalists had between 200 and 300 aircraft. Even so, these aircraft posed a serious threat to the Red Army. To avoid air assaults, the Reds often moved at night. The communists assert they lost 30,000 men to battle, but some skeptics suggest that some of the early Red losses were due to desertions, illness, or exhaustion. Nonetheless, the medics were overwhelmed. In the meantime, a new obstacle loomed ahead, one that threatened to stop the Reds dead in their tracks: the mighty Siang River. Following its breakout from the Jiangxi pocket, the First Red Army marched westward. With the loss of radio contact and thus military direction from Moscow, the communist leaders were sharply divided.
当时李德、博古这些人呢，还是要坚持到湘西来会师，重新在那里的建根地啊，再重新干起。当时毛主席啊，没有军权的问题，毛主席考中不能到那边去，到那边去的话，那会全军覆没。
Mao thought they should instead swing far to southwest China to Sichuan province, where the well-armed Red Fourth Army had retreated. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek had amassed nearly 400,000 troops to block the Reds once and for all at the Siang River. On November 25, 1934, the Red Army threw its entire force against the river blockade. The battle was intense. Communists suffered heavy losses. The Reds' greatest predicament was their massive supply column. The printing presses, coin minting machines, typewriters, everything that slowed them down was tossed into the river. In the process, the communists lost almost all of their government records. After 8 days of savage fighting, the last of the Reds crossed the Siang River. In the United States, Europe, and elsewhere, little was known about the Red Army's fate after the Siang crossing. The world press largely assumed that they had been decisively beaten and that the communist movement in China would soon disappear. It was an impression that Chiang Kai-shek was only too happy to encourage. In the meantime, he hastily ordered his army to block the communists from joining with the Second Red Army. When the First Red Army's intelligence officers discovered this, the Reds swung west instead and easily captured the town of Zunyi on January 7, 1935. There they paused to rest and to care for the wounded that survived the massacre at the Siang River. The mounting death toll brought the brewing controversy about the Army's tactics into the open. On January 15, 1935, the Politburo of the Communist Party Central Committee held a secret meeting in the home of an ancient warlord. Seeing his chance, Mao argued it was time to return to his guerrilla-style tactics.
He believed in mobility, keeping troops moving. He believed in the offense, but not in gathering and gaining cities. He liked to be able to destroy forces. So he wanted to keep the forces moving. He wanted to be able to strike the enemy at their weakest points.
Mao understood that it wasn't necessary to win every battle to prevail. He was well read and was influenced by several ancient Chinese books. He argued that the most important role for a military commander was to preserve and strengthen his forces.
He read the Chinese military classics like Sun Tzu and Sun Bin. He read the literary classics that described battles of warriors and bandits and guerrillas, and took that and applied it to contemporary military action.
Many of Mao's comrades found this kind of thinking strange, even dangerous. But unlike most of these men, Mao had not traveled to Moscow to be indoctrinated in communist orthodoxy.
He had no foreign influence of any importance, apart from reading Karl Marx and some other communist books. So he was a kind of nationalist, above all.
But he understood that maybe 80% of the Chinese populace was in the countryside and what their needs were and how they thought. The doctrinaire Bolsheviks stuck to the line. The peasants and the populace can't be organized, and the only way to win a war and to take over China was to work in the cities.
The Zunyi Conference went on for 3 days. Then Zhou Enlai, who shared command of the Red Army, shifted alliances and sided with Mao. Partly because of this, Mao emerged from the conference triumphant. He was given co-command of the Red Army and eventually promoted to chairman of the Communist Party. The burden Mao Zedong assumed was tremendous. His army was pummeled, and they needed to get out of Zunyi fast. Even worse, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the transport of more troops to the west to corner those he called the Red Bandits. Once again, the two armies were on a collision course. After the disastrous battle at the Siang River, the First Red Army was a shadow of its former self. By January 1935, it lost most of its heavy mortar launchers and nearly 2/3 of its original force of 87,000 men. Meanwhile, the Japanese brushed aside their truce with Chiang Kai-shek and began to expand their territory in northern China. Their next objectives were to the west, the Inner Mongolian province of Chahar and northern Hebei. Chiang monitored these advances, but he was also following the Red Army's advance. Again, he marshaled his men west to block their escape. As the First Red Army pushed on, Mao Zedong reconsidered the ultimate goal of the Long March.
So then the question was where to go. There was 2 or 3 other communist bases in China, in different places, which the Kuomintang had not been able to reach or to assault for various reasons, remote areas, difficult communication, transportation, and so on. So one of these obviously was the place to go for.
Instead of turning back to link up with the Second Red Army, Mao decided instead to try to reach the Fourth Red Army, which had retreated west and was located north of Mao's forces. But the only way to avoid the nationalists in between was to take the least obvious path, to the west. To some, the strategy seemed daring. To others, it appeared reckless. Dozens of rivers and great mountain ranges would need to be crossed to reach the Fourth Red Army in Sichuan province.
They picked the toughest terrain that has never been used by other armies in China. They missed the North China Plain, they missed the Central Plains, they missed the great river systems that would have brought them close to where they were going because they couldn't depend on avoiding the nationalists in those areas. So it was a very, very difficult route.
Since the army was easy to find from the air, Mao and his closest military commander, Zhu De, looked for ways to hide their men.
Zhu De had a strong sense of the ends, the ways, and the means of military strategy. How to move people around the battlefield, how terrain worked, how logistics worked.
The main guerrilla tactic that Mao used during the Long March itself was his dispersing of the marchers into lots of different columns who went on different axes. I mean, they were all going basically to the same place, but they took lots of different routes to get there. And by doing this, they deceived the nationalists as to what their eventual target was, and rather left the nationalists floundering.
Splitting the Red forces also created command and control problems. The teenaged couriers were recruited from the ranks of the youngest of the Red cadres, the so-called Little Red Devils. Most of them were younger than 15 years old. Just as important as command communication was keeping track of the nationalists. Information on Kuomintang forces was gleaned from stories in local newspapers where censorship was lacking. Local peasants provided tips, and spies played a key role. Using this intelligence and his own instincts, Mao threw the Kuomintang off his trail at the Chushui River. As wide as many spots on the Mississippi, the Chushui had no large boats on it. They had been destroyed earlier by Chiang's troops. Red engineers constructed a crude pontoon bridge out of 6 smaller boats, over which they laid a walkway of planks. Then they spread out all over the countryside in smaller groups. To keep the nationalists off his trail, Mao ordered his men to cross over the Chushui River 3 more times. After consolidating his forces, Mao approached the Loshan Pass. This was a narrow choke point the Reds had to pass through to continue their journey west. Mao sensed this was a site where they were vulnerable. He ordered his men to race to the pass. By now, the nationalists had the same objective, but the Reds moved faster, arriving just minutes ahead of the nationalist troops. On February 26, 1935, the two armies collided head-on.
In this case, Mao had to rely on a very committed front echelon that was able to lay down a base of fire with some automatic weapons and use hand grenades to break through a very narrow area.
Over the 2-day battle, Red forces smashed 2 nationalist divisions, killing some 1,000 troops. Mao won his first significant battlefield victory. Most important, his men began to trust his leadership. The Reds took 2,000 prisoners, captured over 1,000 rifles, and added 100,000 bullets to their arsenal. After nearly 2 months of indirect maneuvers to avoid detection, Mao ordered a feint toward the 4th Red Army. A tributary to the Yangtze River, the Golden Sands River had a single ford at a small toll collection point called Jiaoping Fort. With the rest of the Red Army trailing behind, the Communists reported that a single battalion covered an astonishing 85 miles in a single day and night to seize the fort. This was nearly twice the largest daily advance made by the mechanized blitzkriegs across France during World War II. When they reached the fort, the battalion unpacked captured nationalist uniforms and changed their clothing. In a cunning act of trickery, they talked their way into the fort without firing a shot. When Chiang Kai-shek received the news that Mao had successfully crossed the Golden Sands, he was furious. He immediately flew to Sichuan province, where he personally mobilized new forces, hoping to cut the Red Army off at the next critical choke point, the deep-running Dadu River. Chiang was right. The communist forces had dwindled, but they were gaining new recruits and some support from the Chinese peasants. The Reds carefully exploited this antagonism. Strict rules were enacted to gain support from the peasants, but even policies such as the forcible confiscation and redistribution of the landlord's property were not enough to win over all the poorer peoples of China. The First Red Army was about to confront one of its most hostile adversaries yet, a group of fierce warriors who had never accepted the Chinese in their land. In the early 1930s, much of China was disconnected, with many people who had their own languages and cultures. They often lived far from one another and were cut off from modern conveniences like telephones, highways, and electricity. In April 1935, after nearly 180 days of marching, the Red Army entered the territory of one of these indigenous groups. They were a fierce warrior people called the Minority Yi. Their region was known in the West as Lolo Land. An area of dense forests and jagged mountains, Lolo Land remained unconquered and semi-independent of China. Since the Minority Yi people were intensely hostile to the Chinese, Chiang Kai-shek was betting that if the mountainous terrain didn't stop the Reds, the people living there would. At the very least, the harsh terrain would buy him time to move his forces north of the mighty Dadu River for a final showdown with the communists. To solve these problems, the Reds sent envoys to negotiate with the leaders of the Minority Yi. Led by Red Army General Liu Bocheng, who knew the Yi and could speak their language, the Reds made a promise they would keep: to preserve Lolo autonomy if their revolution was successful. With these inducements, the Yi were won over. To seal the bargain, Liu Bocheng and Lolo chieftain Xiao Iadan performed an ancient tribal ceremony. Afterward, many Minority Yi joined the Red Army to guide them through the rough terrain and to help them avoid detection by the nationalists. As a result, a small Red Army corps was able to reach the Dadu River. On the other side, Chiang Kai-shek stationed his forces.
Everyone expected if they simply protected the proper side of the river, they'd be able to defeat the communists. And Chiang Kai-shek put a lot of people there. And he protected at a point that should have been a good defensive position.
On May 25, 1935, the Reds captured the small town of Anshuncheng. More important, they found a single ferry boat that had not yet been destroyed by the local nationalist forces. Over the next 3 days, an entire Red division was transported across the Dadu. But with the river rising and Chiang's forces closing in, the situation was desperate. One boat was clearly not enough to transport the entire army. Meeting on the banks of the river, Mao and his advisors devised a plan. In what has now become legend, though doubted by some historians, the idea would lead to what the Reds contend was the single most critical battle during the Long March. Mao sent a strong force along a narrow trail that wound through the steep gorge carved by the Dadu River. Across the river, the nationalists quickly realized where the Reds were headed. Soon, both sides were racing toward the same objective. Some 90 miles to the west, there was a small bridge across the Dadu River. Built in 1701, the local inhabitants called it the Looting Bridge. As both armies dashed toward the Looting Bridge, the Reds were harassed by nationalist forces on the opposite bank of the Dadu. Gradually, the vanguard of the Red Army pulled ahead, managing to reach the bridge first on May 29, 1935. About 100 yards long and 9 feet wide, it was a third the length of the Brooklyn Bridge. 13 chains held up the side supports, as well as those for the bridge flooring. While some historians have suggested there was little to no resistance, The communists reported that the bridge was held by a local warlords regiment. They claimed the defenders had machine guns and mortars, and that much of the wood planking that formed the footway of the bridge had been removed. 13 heavy iron chains were left hanging over the deep, fast-running river. After a firefight, the Reds secured their side of the bridge. Most of them were surprised the chains were not cut on either side by the local warlord. Crossing the looting bridge appeared to be a suicide mission. A call went out for volunteers, and 22 men stepped forward. Red machine guns on the opposite bank spattered the defenders' positions with bullets, but they couldn't suppress all of them. The communists claim one of the attackers tossed a perfectly aimed grenade into the machine gun nest guarding the end of the bridge. It was soon followed by a barrage of grenades thrown by other Red soldiers who were following along behind the assault team, replanking the chains as they crossed. In desperation, the defenders set fire to their position, but it was too little, too late. The scope of the battle has been questioned by some historians who contend the story was later embellished. But the fact remains that the First Red Army followed its volunteers across the Dadu. By not cutting the bridge's chain links, Chiang's forces missed a golden opportunity. However, the long march was far from over. The Reds were heavily outnumbered and still retreating, heading toward the comparative safety of Sichuan province. In fact, the Reds were about to confront their most formidable natural obstacle: the jagged peaks of some of the highest mountains in the world. June 1935. 8 months and over 3,000 miles into the long march, the Red Army moved into western Sichuan province. With Chiang Kai-shek still trying to decide on his next move, the Reds were safe from the pursuing nationalists, at least for the moment. In the meantime, Japanese newsreels touted the occupation of Manchuria as the Imperial Army was occupying another northern Chinese province, Yohua. Yet patriotism alone could not surmount the awesome natural barrier that lay right in the Red Army's path. It was a series of peaks called the Snowy Mountains, some towering over 15,000 feet. Because of these extreme conditions, the nationalists decided to let nature do their work for them. The Snowies were not a well-defined range, but a series of jagged mountains and high passes in an area of China that was so remote that much of it had not been mapped. Some historians cite Mao's choice to cross the Snowies as an example of blundering, but at this point, he had no other choice to avoid the nationalists. Besides the fact that the Reds were exhausted and decimated by over 240 days of marching, most had no experience climbing or surviving in mountains. Nearly all of them came from the hot and humid semi-tropical areas of southern China, and few had ever seen mountainous snowy terrain, let alone climbed it. Most had no heavy clothing, and put on layers of the light cotton uniforms they had at the beginning of the march instead. Many of them lacked proper boots, and some wore makeshift footwear, stuffed with straw. The high altitude was a constant deadly enemy. The lack of oxygen threatened to transform exhaustion into death. Between peaks, firewood was always in demand to use for cooking, but carrying tree branches far distances was demanding. Daily rations typically consisted of a half-pound of rice or sweet potatoes for breakfast, and a similar amount for dinner, the actual quantity was usually far less because of the difficulty in distributing food to a column of troops that stretched over many trails. Some Reds were stricken by snow blindness, a condition caused by the sunlight reflecting intensely off the snow. It produced temporary blindness in its victims. Medical personnel were instructed to march at the rear of the column to care for injured and sick stragglers. Many men chose to slide to get down the mountains, but this was more dangerous than it appeared, and many were lost, catapulting off the cliffs. After climbing over several mountain peaks, the Reds claim they lost nearly 9,000 people. Some of Mao's generals would later write that they had little time to adequately prepare for the snowy mountains. Mao Zedong's tattered First Red Army finally reached the Maogong area of northwest Sichuan province on July 20th, 1935. There it linked up with the Fourth Red Army. The two armies fielded a combined force of nearly 100,000 soldiers. But they could not stay together for long. It was only a matter of time before the nationalists mounted another encirclement campaign. A celebration took place between the two armies, with cordial outward appearances, but just under the surface ran a current of suspicion and bitterness. The Fourth Red Army was commanded by an old rival of Mao, Zhang Guotao. He considered Mao's army to be weak in spirit and in arms. By now, however, Mao re-established radio contact with Moscow. He insisted they continue north toward Shanxi province, an isolated area closer to the border with the friendly Soviet Union. Zhang Guotao was well aware of the dangerous swamplands that had to be crossed, and he strongly disagreed. After several stormy meetings, Zhang finally agreed to follow Mao northward. But the Reds' problems were far from over. Not only was Chiang Kai-shek beginning to consolidate his forces for yet another attempt to corner the Reds, but a new barrier loomed ahead, one that would prove to be the deadliest natural obstacle along the trail. August 21st, 1935. It was the height of summer as Mao Zedong and Zhang Guotao's combined Red Armies entered the Great Grasslands on the border of China's Sichuan province and Tibet. After walking for nearly 300 days, Mao's troops were in the last stages of the Long March. There were more direct and easier routes to get to their new objective in Shanxi province, but they would have taken the Reds through areas strongly held by the enemy. Once again, fearing the nationalists were closing in, Mao left little time for his generals to prepare. Upon hearing that an army was coming, the local nomads abandoned their villages, taking all their food and cattle with them. Even worse than the food supply was the weather. Constant rain turned the ground into an immense swamp. It was a deadly trap. Beneath the flowers that covered the grasslands lurked bogs that could swallow men and animals. Even in August, the temperatures hovered just above freezing, and food became even more scarce. To ensure there were enough provisions for everyone, the army rationed what it had. For some, the penalty for breaking the rule was severe. Despite the harsh conditions, the long march continued. Ultimately, the Red Army reported more deaths in the grasslands than in the snowy mountains. Forces loyal to the nationalists were still in pursuit, but they fared even worse than the communists in the Great Grasslands and were eventually forced to turn back with only a fraction of their numbers intact. After Mao's and Zhang Guotao's combined Red Armies successfully crossed the Great Grasslands, the two leaders renewed their dispute about the goal of the Long March. While Mao felt that the Red Army needed the relative safety and distance from Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang still felt he was strong enough to return south and re-establish the communist presence. Some on both sides wanted to keep the armies from splitting up by force. As tensions ran high, so did the risk of a new civil war, this one within the Red Army. So, perhaps wisely, the two armies decided to separate. With some 80,000 men, Jiang returned to the south, taking the lion's share of the Red supplies. Mao led about 10,000 die-hard supporters to the north, toward Shanxi province. Ironically, the split may have helped Mao's forces to gain some breathing room from the pursuing nationalists. The loss of the Fourth Red Army left Mao's forces seriously weakened. With hundreds of miles of rugged territory to cross and numerous battles yet to fight, they were more vulnerable than ever. In September 1935, the Red Army reached the border with Gansu province, just south of their objective, Shanxi province. Here they faced one last natural obstacle to their advance, the Lazico Pass. The pass at Lazico was extremely narrow, in some spots just 12 feet wide. The right side consisted of a cliff that rose almost vertically for 1,000 feet. Just across the gorge rose another cliff, this one not quite as high as the other. The pass was defended from above by nationalist blockhouses. In all, 3 regiments and 2 battalions held the important corridor. On September 15th, Mao issued the following order: "We must take the Lazico Pass or go back through the grasslands." Mao issued the following order: "We must take the Lazico Pass or go back through the grasslands." Given the suffering the Reds endured in the swamps, this was the last place any of them wanted to go. But a succession of night attacks failed with heavy casualties. Mao ordered a halt to direct assaults and turned to a band of experienced mountaineers to develop a new plan. From prisoners, they learned that additional nationalist forces would soon arrive. With time running out, they set out into the darkness and began to scale one side of the sheer canyon wall. After an agonizing climb, the Red assault team reached the top and began raining grenades down on the nationalists. Still, the defenders refused to withdraw. Finally, according to the communists, one volunteer in the Red assault team lit all of his explosives, then threw himself into the nationalist position. The nationalist soldiers who survived the blast ran for their lives. The Red Army would not have to return to the grasslands. October 20, 1935. After 368 days of relentless marching and fighting, Mao Zedong's First Red Army finally reached Shanxi province. The long march appeared to be over. In Shanxi, the vanguard of the First Red Army linked up with other Red forces that had earlier established a small base of communist power in this desolate area. Here, the rugged landscape helped to protect the Reds. Of the original 87,000 men and women who began the long march, fewer than 6,000 made it to Shanxi. Together with the 30,000 Red troops already in Shanxi, the survivors of Mao's army began to recruit a new army, one that would begin a gradual, relentless drive to control all of China. Although the Long March was technically a defeat, the communists ultimately won a political victory. During the journey, they passed through provinces populated by millions of people, winning thousands of converts along the way. The Long March transformed Mao Zedong from a regional figure into a budding national leader. He now had a following among common people from all over China. Yet, to win a civil war in China, Mao would need hundreds of thousands of new soldiers. But the question was, where would he get them? Several months after the First Red Army arrived in Shanxi, Zhang Guotao's Fourth Red Army straggled into camp. His army was decimated during battles with the nationalists. 2 out of every 3 of his men were killed. Ironically, it was the Japanese occupation that helped the Reds. Communist propaganda teams exploited the issue, proclaiming that the Red Army was the only Chinese military force that would stand up to the invaders. This message struck a nerve with the local people in Shanxi. By 1937, Chiang Kai-shek was preparing for another major campaign against Mao's army. But by now, some in his military alliance had seen enough. The Red Army and the Nationalists finally agreed to an anti-Japanese alliance in 1937. But the truce was uneasy. When their joint campaign against Japan ended in 1945, the simmering conflict exploded into civil war. By now, the Red Army had over 1 million soldiers. It held 19 base areas and controlled a population of 100 million people across the North China Plain. But the Western powers threw their support and massive amounts of military assistance to Chiang Kai-shek. For many communists, the Long March was still not over. 1945. Following almost 8 years of an uneasy alliance to fight the invading Japanese, the Reds and Nationalists battled in a renewed civil war. Now more was at stake than just the future of China. This was the first showdown of the Cold War. For some nationalists, the defeat came as a shock. Others could see it coming. In 1949, the nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek were driven off the mainland and took refuge on the island of Taiwan. Chiang never returned to China. On October 1st, Mao Zedong declared the foundation of the People's Republic of China in Tiananmen Square. The ultimate outcome of the Long March was finally decided. China was no longer a collection of semi-independent provinces ruled by feudal warlords, but a nation that was finally unified under the flag of the Communist Red Army. Most communists believed the seeds for victory in 1949 were planted along the rugged trail of the Long March.
正像毛泽东说的那样啊，长征是宣言书，他向全世界宣告，红军是英雄好汉，这一点丝毫也不夸张。可以说，古今中外历史上啊，很难有与之相比拟的。红军凭着坚定的革命信念，战胜了一切艰难险阻，最后赢得了红军长征的胜利。
The nationalists could not dispute the fact that Mao Zedong's core group of 6,000 die-hard survivors went on to take over a country of 500 million people. The veterans of the Long March earned a standing that virtually ensured their place within the Communist Party. Most all of the high-ranking government and military officials during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s were survivors of the march.
And that held that party leadership together really until almost 1995, 96. Some of those original Long Marchers who were the leaders of the country began to die.
Those few veterans who are still alive have attained a special, almost celebrity status and are treated with extraordinary respect. Standing head and shoulders above all the survivors is Mao Zedong. Despite decades of starvation and suffering by the Chinese people under some of his policies, he is still referred to by some as the great helmsman of the revolution. Mao, Zhou Enlai, Zhu Da, and the others who led the Long March are now considered to be the founding fathers of modern China. By most standards, their Long March Odyssey was a remarkable feat. It's an epic tale now taught in military academies the world over. Although some historians dismiss details of the communist story as propaganda, many agree it was an astonishing military maneuver. In 1 year and a day, the First Red Army covered nearly 6,000 miles, the distance from New York to San Francisco and back again. They averaged nearly 24 miles per day. They climbed 18 major mountain ranges and crossed over 24 rivers. The Reds occupied 62 cities and towns and broke through 10 enveloping armies commanded by local warlords. But the First Red Army was not the only group to undertake a long march. In an achievement that makes the tale all the more remarkable, 2 other major Red Armies eventually made their way north. They overcame many of the same mountains, swamplands, and hostile warlords along the way.
For me, the Long March must rate with some of the most epic military expeditions throughout history. Nobody has ever retreated anything like that distance, suffered such immense casualties and yet managed to keep the basic organisation together. It's a quite remarkable achievement for which there's no real parallel throughout human history.
The ability to take, starting out with over 100,000 people, and over the course of a year, mostly on foot, without supplies, without being able to count on support as you went, move that far in that period of time across that kind of terrain, I think is one of the heroic military achievements in history.
The story reached the West after a sympathetic American writer, Edgar Snow, recorded Mao Zedong's account verbatim in 1936. Snow's book was welcomed in China, and afterward the march took on mythological proportions. Today, the tale is a virtual cornerstone of China's national identity.
It's an important mythology because the Long March represents perseverance under hardship, bravery, and the ability to continue towards a goal despite the suffering. And it represents politically tremendous cooperation among the leadership of the Communist Party.
毛主席呢曾经说这么句话：长征啊，将来啊，长征胜利啊，还会发芽、长叶、开花、结果。他还预言说，将来啊会取得收获的，这个收获是相当大的。
Just as tourists visit the famous battlefields of Europe, people from all over China visit the famous landmarks of the Long March. At every significant location of the journey, monuments dot the Chinese landscape. They stand in mute testimony to an extraordinary event, a quest for survival that ultimately charted a new path for China.
长征是伟大，毛主席他们领导的好，所以才有今天。现在我们国家组织得很好，发展得快。 那都是原来的更好啊！来贯彻长征的精神，死了那么多的人。现在我们是享福啊，享谁的？享他们的福。所以我说不要忘他之心了。
是啊，牺牲的真的是很自然的，没办法。我们在永远都牺牲了，我们在合作，技术完成他没有完成的业务，这一代的不仅是我们这一代。 我们也希望呢，是我们的中国人民、中国的，是啊，青年一代，要继续，要有继承这个方面。